Hello, and welcome to Climate Fiction and its role in fighting the climate emergency. I am Jerusha René, currently the CEO of WriteHive, and I am here with Evan Mylonas. Could you tell us a little about yourself?
Hi, Jerusha. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to have a discussion about something that is pretty close to my heart. So my name is Evan. I'm the author of the speculative fiction novel The Hush, which is coming out in July this year by Inspired Quill. I have some short stories published in Clarksvold and on Spec magazine. I have a marine biology and environment science background, which is, I guess, probably the reason why climate fiction and climate change are subjects that are so important to me.
All right. So, what inspired you to specifically become an advocate for the climate cause?
So I got my degrees back in the early 2000s, and back then there was a feeling in academia that we could still turn things around at that point. It was going to be difficult. We knew that if we didn't change things around, we were heading towards a potential disaster scenario, but it was still feasible if we cut emissions and if we made drastic changes to the way that we live in order to avoid a global temperature increase. And right now we're 2 decades later and the goalposts have shifted, and we're no longer talking about preventing a global temperature increase, but we're talking about minimizing it. We went from no global temperature increase to maybe we can do 1.5 degrees Celsius and within the next few decades. And some scenarios are calling for being a little bit more pessimistic and talking about 2 degrees Celsius. So it's a little scary, honestly. We're already seeing the impact. We're seeing the impact in, for example, the people of Tuvalu who are negotiating with Australia about leaving their islands because they're going under. They're going under the sea right now. We're seeing some extreme events that normally would happen once in a decade, just happening year after year after year after year, and we're seeing dead people. We're seeing disasters taking place on a regular basis. So you're seeing that kind of scenario and you're thinking, well, I can't really stand by and not do anything. I mean, I am an author, I'm a writer, and writing stories is what I do. So anything that anybody can contribute towards this cause, people should be doing that. People should be fighting about preventing those catastrophic scenarios that we're seeing are coming. They're in the future. They're on the horizon.
Yeah.
So I just couldn't stand back and stand aside and not do anything.
So, how did climate fiction become prolific enough to be considered a subgenre?
So I'm a big horror fan. And one thing I really like about horror films or disaster films and all that is that normally they reflect the anxieties of the people of the time, right? So one of the great examples that I like using is Godzilla, which was very specifically the Japanese people's anxieties about nuclear warfare. So suddenly you had this huge lizard that turned huge because of nuclear radiation, and then suddenly starts shooting laser beams out of its mouth. Quite entertaining, but there's a very real anxiety behind all of that. There's the anxiety of something that is created by nuclear radiation just destroying your cities.
Right.
And you have Dracula, for example, being the fear of the aristocracy sucking the blood of the common people, for example. So we're at a time when you keep hearing climate change, climate change, climate change. People are looking into those scenarios that we're talking about. They're hearing scientists saying things are getting very, very serious, and just they're looking outside their windows as well. They're looking outside the windows. They're looking at freak weather patterns. They're hearing about their houses going under the sea. They're seeing fish getting boiled in the ocean, like it happened in Australia last year. So all of that creates this, in my opinion, it creates this feeling of anxiety. I'm suffering a little bit from that anxiety as well, and they're thinking, well, what do we do about this? What do we do? And one of the ways to channel that anxiety is, let's write a story. Let's try to exercise those demons. Let's try to give voice to our concerns and sort of explore in a therapeutic manner what is it that we're so scared, right? So it feels very strange bringing climate change at the same level as Godzilla, but this is where we are right now.
It definitely is scary. Do you consider climate change as preaching a political agenda?
I definitely think that talking about the climate and writing climate fiction has political repercussions. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter which side of the spectrum you're sitting on. An example, a metaphor that I often use on my blog is, imagine you're in this spaceship, and the spaceship has a life support system, and you don't have another spaceship. That's just it. If that spaceship dies, you die. And there's a bunch of people sitting down at the life support system room, just banging at it and messing with it. And for what? Some of them are doing it because they're making some profit out of it. Some of them are doing it because they don't particularly care. Just makes the life a little bit more convenient. Now, what would any sane person do if they figure out that there's some idiot sitting in the life support system room messing with it? I would probably just put them in an airlock and shoot them out into space, right?
At least pull them away from the life support system.
At the very least. At the very least. I mean, it's not a matter of politics. I mean, in order to do anything about climate change, we're probably going to need to take a very, very long and hard look at how our political systems are working. But in the end of the day, it is about survival, right? I mean, if a meteor were to strike Earth, we won't be arguing about what the left thinks, what the right thinks. We'll be looking at the asteroid hurling towards Earth and saying, we need to do something about this now. And I don't care where on the spectrum you're sitting. We need to do something now.
Right. Do you think we're heading towards the sort of future that some climate fiction books describe?
We might. There's several different disaster scenarios that are being described in climate fiction. Personally, my main concern, I have two main concerns. One of them is the global food production system. The other one is our water reserves. If these get impacted, things are going to get pretty ugly from there. We're talking about mass migrations. We're talking about warfare for resources. We're talking about huge refugee waves, creating a lot of issues in countries that do not have the infrastructure to support them. And you also get into some more nightmare scenarios, such as permafrost melting and then releasing some sort of virus that we have no way of dealing with because our immune systems just haven't been adapted to it. I'm trying to not be pessimistic. Certainly, I would like to avoid some of the more extreme scenarios, such as everybody turning cannibal. I would very much like to avoid that. But I'm very much concerned that we're at least going to see some of the scenarios in climate fiction playing out in real time. And that is an extremely scary thought. If you were to tell somebody that, your post-apocalyptic fiction is not going to be fiction in a few years' time, that doesn't sound very good.
Yeah, no. Well, do you think that climate fiction can make an impact on the climate crisis?
Certainly hope so. There's good examples of books that in the past have had an impact on the way that we operate as a society, right? So one of my favorite books is The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. And when that book came out, it did have a huge impact on the American New Deal. There is the Jungle by Sinclair Absent that apparently had a pretty big impact on how the meat industry conducts itself. I would like to think that a single book might change things around, but that would be way too optimistic on my behalf. But at the same time, we're seeing even in later years, we're seeing books such as The Handmaid's Tale becoming the trigger for a lot of activism, and that book is now considered to be a seminal feminist text. So, can fiction change things? Yeah, probably. Climate fiction specifically, I hope that it at least can add to to all the other activities that we're carrying out. I don't believe that a single book will change the course of the future, but I certainly do believe that it can have an impact. It can get people thinking, and it can lead to action. So fingers crossed that climate fiction can actually do something.
What impact do you think it can have on its readers, climate fiction?
Well, I've always been the kind of person who thought that protests and demonstrations didn't really have much of an impact, because you get on the streets, you make a lot of noise. Does anything happen? Probably not. But then that opinion of mine changed over time. I did a little bit of reading, I read a little bit of research, and basically said that it's not the actual act of going out there and making noise that matters, it's the fact that you're doing something. It gets the individual into a mindset of carrying out activism, carrying out specific actions. So what I would hope about climate fiction is that it would at least get people to start asking questions. I would hope that they would seek out information. They wouldn't just stay with the stories themselves, because stories are stories, they're fiction, but they would take an extra step of asking themselves how much of this is based on reality. Margaret Atwood very famously said that she never writes anything that hasn't happened or is not about to happen. And it's very interesting when you're looking at fiction from that point of view, because essentially, to be a little bit cheesy, essentially just taking a mirror and putting it in front of society, right? So if you start from that point, then ideally it will propel you to carry out some activism. It will make you pressure politicians to come up with solutions. An interesting thing about climate change is that if you ask people whether or not they want to do something about it, they'll probably answer yes. I do want to do something about climate fiction, but they usually don't know what that something is about. They don't know what to do. They're not given solutions. So, I always think that individual action is extremely important, but it's unlikely that the recycling that you and I do on an individual level will have the impact that we want. It's important enough, because what it does is it puts us in the mindset that we need to be doing something, and recycling is the first step. Pressuring your politicians to do something about it is the next step. Pressuring your companies to do something about it is another step. One of the things that the whole COVID pandemic showed us is that if the reason is deemed important enough, there's not a single part of society that will overthink this, right? I mean, overnight we get changes in how we work. Now we telecommute. Companies start making masks and disinfectants in very efficient manner. So, it's all a matter of willingness. And being willing to do something about it from a politician or a capitalist point of view is all about how much pressure you and I can apply, right? It's about going to the politicians and saying, you know what, if you don't do something about this, I'm not going to elect you anymore. Or it's going to whichever consumer company and saying, or even energy companies as well, and saying, if you don't do something about this, if you don't cut emissions, if you don't help our society to get better, if you don't help us prevent this scenario, I'm just not going to buy your product. Just hurt them where it matters. So I'm hoping that people reading climate fiction will get them in that kind of mindset where they're thinking, you know what, I'm going to go out there. I know I'm just one person, but I'm one person, you're one person, and the other person is just one person. But together we can apply enough pressure so that we can change things around. So that's my hope by people reading climate fiction.
All right. And what do you hope? What makes a good climate fiction story?
Not preaching. Not preaching, because at the end of the day, a climate fiction story is still a story, and it needs to be good. It needs to be a good story. And usually, we do not write good stories by making grand sweeping statements saying, climate change bad. Well, we kind of know that intellectually speaking, right? But what really works is focusing on the human stories. Take the climate change away from the foreground, put it on the background, keep it as a sandbox, and then focus on the little stories that say something about the human condition, and take it from there. Use climate change as an excuse to explore humanity. That's what I'm mostly interested in when I'm reading a story. I'm interested in learning something, and I'm interested in getting a different perspective. I'm interested in an author telling me something that I haven't considered before. And this is primarily what I'm looking into a story. And climate fiction isn't any different. The fact that there is a very strong existential threat looming over us, that is also very important. But you kind of need to bait people to get your point across. Sounds a little bit manipulative. Maybe it is. But in the end of the day, Stephen King said something very interesting, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, which is a story is essentially a lie that tells a big truth. So you need to be aware of the fact that you're still trying to spin a good yarn, still trying to tell a good story, and it doesn't have to be entertaining. If it can be entertaining, by all means. But don't preach, don't make it on the nose, don't put climate change at the foreground and saying, look what is happening. There's essays for that, there's nonfiction for that. There is a time and a place for that, but when it comes to fiction, the craft usually requires that you focus on the human element. And just use climate fiction as an excuse.
So what do you hope to see in the future of climate fiction?
Probably going to be shooting myself in the foot here, but maybe a little bit more optimism. Things look, I'm saying I'm going to be shooting myself in the foot because I'm not the most optimistic of people. But things do look dire. We might fail. We might fail the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. We might start talking about 2 degrees Celsius. We might have to start building seawalls. We might starve. But despair is not a strategy that we can afford, because if you despair, then you just sit back and not do anything. You need to always operate on the premise that you can change things. Doesn't matter how desperate things seem, we just can't afford that kind of attitude. So I would like to see more positive stories. I would like to see stories that get people away from the mindset of why bother if it's all going to happen anyway. This is not a healthy mindset. Even if we're not going to make it, we still need to be operating on the premise that we're not fighting to lose here. So I'm not sure that I can write a positive story like that, but I certainly hope that this we'll start seeing a few more optimistic, a few more utopian stories out there. We need them. We need them.
So what titles would you start with if you wanted to read or learn more about climate fiction?
So I would say start with Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. That is the prototype climate fiction story. And if I remember correctly, that was written in the early 90s, but parts of it don't even read like science fiction anymore. So kind of shows how far we've gone with the whole climate change thing. It does dedicate quite large sections to California wildfires, which are becoming worse and worse, as we've seen year after year. It does refer to the financial systems trying to adapt to an environment where it's just not enough jobs to go around. gated communities, things like that. So pretty scary, and even scarier by the fact that a lot of those things, a lot of the elements that Octavio Butler was writing about could find their way today in the nonfiction section of a library. Start from that. A more later book is Mylonas, The History of Peace. That's a great book by one of the great Norwegian writers. It does talk quite a lot about peace, as the title suggests. It goes back and forth in time between the Victorian age and one of the early beekeepers. It talks about current times and about the plight of the Californian farmers not being able to protect the crops because the bees are just not there anymore. And it also goes into a future where the bees are just not there anymore, and we have to hand pollinate everything, which incidentally and scarily is something that happens right now in certain parts of the world. If I'm not mistaken, this is, I don't want to say a common practice because it sounds very scary, but it is a practice that takes place in China. So literally, you have people going to almond trees, orange trees with little pipettes and try to get the pollen and then deposit it into a flower so that we can get a fruit out of it, which is mind-numbingly time-consuming, and it's very labor-intensive. And nature has given us this wonderful pollen dispersion mechanism. The bee is just absolutely perfect. It's a perfect mechanism any way you look at it, and it's in the story. The bees are gone. And this isn't very far away from the future. I mean, the bees are suffering from what is called a catastrophic hive. I'm probably getting the term wrong, but essentially their catastrophic hive collapse, that's what it's called. For reasons that we can pinpoint, the bees are just dropping dead, right? No bees, no food, no humans. Scary outlook. Probably overused that word today, but
it is scary.
But it is scary. It is scary. There's no two ways about it. So Mylonas, The History of Peace, I would check that out. And third book that I would recommend is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. I'm a huge fanboy of Cormac McCarthy. A lot of people would argue that it's not a climate fiction story, but Cormac McCarthy has gone on record saying that he based the story on some thoughts he had about how El Paso in Texas would look like 100 years in the future. And his anxiety about dying and then leaving his son unprepared for that future. He has mentioned that he envisioned this future where El Paso is just on fire, fires on the hills and ash raining from the sky. And this is what the book looks like. The movie is pretty good as well. Some very striking visuals of Viggo Mortensen walking through a landscape that looks like it's covered by snow, because just tons of ash because everything's burnt.
Wow.
There is no food, there is no hope. There's the cannibalism that I mentioned a little bit earlier was a little bit extreme, but I hope we never get there. Very bleak, but in the end of the day, it is Cormac McCarthy. The prose is absolutely wonderful. And it's just a very, very good book. If you dive into that book, keeping in mind that we might be heading into this scenario, we might be heading into a catastrophic scenario where everything just burns. I have personally been in a forest wildfire, and that's the kind of stuff that stays with you.
I'm in California, so we have lots of them.
It's just not very pretty. I mean, just the sound of the fire and sounding like a wild beast. That kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that I'm never gonna forget. So, sort of extrapolating that and then thinking, what would the world look like if the entire world were on fire? I'm gonna use that word again. Scary. Very, very scary.
It is, yes.
So, I would say start with those three books. They're definitely my favorite books on climate fiction. But the truth of the matter is that there's just tons of books handling climate fiction out there. There is people are coming around, and writers in particular are paying a little bit more attention to what's happening out there. I've always loved post-apocalyptic fiction because it's actually, I don't know why I loved it so much. It kind of makes me go down the what if scenarios, makes me go down into some interesting rabbit holes. But there is no point talking about aliens or zombies or kaijus or Godzilla or whatever when you have a post-apocalyptic scenario just staring you in the face saying, I'm right here. I'm just 20 years away from you. We're talking about scenarios where humans are just not going to be able to survive in certain parts of the world. And we're talking about humanity. We're talking about the one species that just doesn't care. You know what? I don't care. Give me whatever niche possible. I'll thrive into it. But we are getting to that scenario. We are getting into that future where we're just not going to be able to do that anymore. The one perfect machine of survival will not be able to survive on this planet. So that is one scenario that kind of trumps all other scenarios. I don't care about your aliens or your zombies or whatever. This is the one scenario that should be keeping people up at night.
Do you have any last words for our viewers?
Well, I hope I've scared enough people.
Yes.
I certainly hope I've scared enough people to hopefully dive into climate fiction and, being a little bit cheeky, take your recycling a little bit more seriously. First, that's always the first step. I mean, just write to your politicians, let them know in uncertain terms that if things get bad, we're coming for them. We need them to change things around. We know they can change things around. We know they can apply policies. We know that they can promote the appropriate tools that we need, renewable energy resources, cutting emissions, rethinking the whole food supply chain. We know we can do this. So if there is any excuse about why we're not doing this, then they can just forget about it because we're talking about an existential threat here. Read, be active, and being active leads to activism. This is the big fight, in my opinion. I mean, this is something that we cannot afford to be complacent about. And as a bit of a shameless plug as well, my book, The Hush, coming out in July, also deals with climate fiction, primarily deals with breakdown of communication, but it's set in the background of changing climate and droughts. So coming out in July, would make me very happy if you pick that up. It would make me very happy if you support indie publishers as well. And just continue reading, please.
All right. Thank you very much. And for our live audience, we will have question and answers following this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.